All right. Okay. Well, sorry for some technical issues there, but really want to welcome everybody to this month's Cyber Showcase, a conversation about network security. We're going to have a little game here. Hopefully, we'll have some fun. We'll see how that goes. As always, I'm your host, Bret Rock, a business development and product specialist here at SBS. And I am joined by Cyber Showcase Hall of Famer Justin Kurtner. He's here for the third time. So jumped into the lead in terms of people that have joined me here. So, Justin, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. Glad to be back. I didn't realize I was the Hall of Famer now, but glad to know
Look at
that.
that.
But my name's Justin Kurtner. I'm the network security manager here for SBS. I've been with the company about 10 years. I've got a background in network security, IT generally around hospital operations, banking, industry, regulatory guidance, all of the above. So
great. Well, very grateful to have you back. So I would say once every 6 months, I drag Justin on here to talk about what's new in network security testing. We try to have fun with it, try to talk about some of the things you should be doing, some of the things you might want to think about doing. Today, we're going to try something new. I've come up with some different scenarios, fake ones, not real ones, but I think you'll be able to sympathize with some of them. And then Justin's going to help me match some of the services that those scenarios may want to consider going forward. If this winds up being super lame, we will not do it again, and we'll just never talk about it as though we'll just talk about it as though it never happened. So we'll see how it goes. But in terms of the agenda, we're going to start with some introductions. I'm going to talk a little bit about some cool things we got coming from SBS. We are going to jump right into what I'm calling our network security match game. For those of you who are fans of match game, we're going to follow that format. Anybody who's not familiar with it, it's not that hard, I promise. We'll do some what's next, pin Justin down on maybe what he's going to talk about 6 months from now, do some takeaways, and hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A as well. Just quickly, a little housekeeping. If you have questions, please go ahead and enter them in the chat or in the question box. If we do have time, I'll try to get to them at the end. If not, we certainly will follow up with you directly. Alternatively, you are welcome to reach out to Justin or myself. Our contact information is up here. We'll also put it up at the end. If you do want a copy of the recording or the slide deck when we're finished, we'll be happy to send that along as well. And then if you don't mind, take that quick survey at the end. That really does help us get a better sense of how we're doing and how we might be able to help you going forward. So with that said, let's jump into some things here. For those of you who are not familiar with SBS, although I can't imagine there are a ton of you on the call here, but we have been in the industry for over 20 years now. We have all kinds of clients in different industries, obviously financial services being the primary one. And we've got all kinds of great offerings and different things that we hope you will take advantage of. So if you haven't worked with us before, please reach out. We're happy to see how we might be able to help you guys. One thing that is here from SBS that we're very excited about, we did launch our new NIST CSF assessment module of our track tool that came out about almost a month ago now, maybe 3 weeks to a month ago now. So as you're scrambling to figure out how to replace the CAT as it sunsets at the end of August this year, we do have a free version of our NIST module. You're welcome to sign up for that by going to our website, www.sbscyber.com. Click on that products drop down and NIST, and that will take you to a page where you can sign up for the free version. We do have a premium version that does have some really cool bells and whistles, including the ability to set target goals and things like that. So again, happy to demo that if you're ever interested. I don't have a slide for this, but I am very excited to announce, you guys are probably the first people to hear this publicly. We do have our CRI profile module that will be released hopefully in the next week or two. So we will be able to demo that, and you'll be hearing more about that going forward. So if you're interested in the CRI profile as an alternative, we will have a module for that in the very, very near future. A couple other things that are coming. I always like to talk about our SBS Institute webinars. We've got one coming up here on May 21st. Shane Daniel from our team on the consulting side is going to talk about planning, testing, conquering, how you can use your BCP and IRP to save your business. He's going to dig into all the great stuff there to provide you a comprehensive understanding of why those tests are so essential and how they can help safeguard you. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And then our new IT audit manager and formerly on the consulting side, still handles vendor management. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Laura Zanucci. She's going to cover best practices in vendor risk management for 2025, how to build a modern vendor management program, how to do your risk assessments, how to do AI vendor management and what to look for there. So again, I think that will be a great topic as well. So lots of great things coming. Encourage you as always to check out our website for more information on all of that. All right, so with that said, let's jump into things today, the network security match game. So again, what we're going to try to do here, and I will not hold Justin responsible. This was all my idea. So again, if it's bad, blame it on me. But we're going to go through a handful of different scenarios that we've come up with here. We're going to talk about kind of what they look like, what the size and complexity of the organization looks like, what they're doing currently from a network security perspective. And then we're going to ask a pretty simple question. What would we recommend they consider doing at this point? Because, and Justin, maybe I'll let you touch on this before we get into it even. There's not a one-size-fit-all thing when it comes to network security testing. And it doesn't seem like the sort of thing that you should jump from doing absolutely nothing up to red team testing necessarily. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that before we dive into how these scenarios might play out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that we talk about a lot, specifically with newer customers, is kind of we try to meet them where they are. Like you said, you don't want to go in and recommend a very large 2-month-long red team service whenever they've never even done external pen testing or social engineering. So, we try to meet the clients where they are with, their maturity and their security posture. So typically we start with what we consider kind of the basics: compliance packages, external testing, social engineering, so forth. If they're more advanced than that, we'll move into some of our more advanced offerings.
So again, I think one of the takeaways we'll probably discuss toward the end here, and hopefully you'll get as we're moving through this, is it is a progression. It is something where you start in one spot and can kind of move from there. And the idea of being proactive versus being reactive, right? So one of the survey questions I've got is kind of how you think about your program currently, your network security testing program. Are we doing these things because we're told we have to, or are we doing them because we know it's good security practices and we know that it's going to make us better going forward? And that's where we're going to talk about some of the more of the large scale testing that we do offer that may not necessarily be necessary to meet compliance regulations, but really can give you the best understanding of what your environment looks like. So I think we're going to talk about some really fun different ones. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So match number one. This is Friendly First Bank out of Cedarville, Oregon. They are $125 million in assets. Again, this is a completely fake institution. One of their board members attended a webinar titled "Phishing, Not Just for Lakes Anymore," and they decided to, quote, get serious about cybersecurity. They hired a recent college graduate named Trevor recently to be a cybersecurity analyst, the very first one. His first act was to institute multi-factor authentication. This resulted in the CFO being unable to access his account for 48 hours, and Trevor is now known as Captain Lockout. Right now, for Friendly First Bank, their network security testing consists of an external penetration test, and they do once a year social engineering testing, but only for those below the C-suite. So, Justin, if we're going to talk about how Friendly First Bank wants to improve their network security testing, they're kind of, sounds like they're on the baseline level here. What would we recommend they start with?
So if they've ever only done external testing and they do one random social engineering event every year for people underneath the C-suite, the first suggestion I would have would be, let's expand your social engineering offering a little bit. Maybe let's look at doing quarterly or semi-annual phishing for everyone to include the C-suite level. It always kind of entertains me whenever I see instances like this that are real. I know this one's kind of made up, but we do see these for real. And, the executive level are just as much of a threat, if not more of a threat than, some of the just typical employees. So I would definitely recommend a little bit more advanced social engineering offering. And I would also start to look towards internal testing, whether that's just an internal vulnerability assessment or potentially even an internal pen test would be my recommendation.
Sure. So, and I'll give you actually a good example. We resell KnowBe4. Justin, you obviously know that, and I'm sure many of the people on the webinar are familiar as well. I remember one of the first years we were selling it kind of early on in the process, we got an email from a bank that wanted to cancel it. And when we asked why, it was because their CEO got tricked into clicking on a phishing test and got so angry that he made them cancel the contract. They weren't going to use it anymore. And I think that kind of goes along with one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, Justin, is why do you think it's so important for leadership to be involved in the testing, and kind of how big a difference does it make when that cybersecurity culture comes from the top down?
Yeah, it's funny. I made a LinkedIn post about this a few days ago. The culture is just as much important as the actual testing itself. Whenever you have an organization that the top down is only wanting employees to do the training and they're not willing to do it themselves, they set the precedence of, this is not important because I'm not doing it. So whenever you have an organization whose executive level team takes their security posture and their testing as seriously as everyone else, they want to take it seriously, it just creates a different type of environment. It creates a kind of a top-down approach is obviously the wording there, but it's really more about having everyone on the same page and trying to accomplish the same goal. So it's very important. Definitely something that we recommend. We talk about regularly on our, exit meetings with clients and just different things, but it's a 100% very important factor in the overall view of testing.
Yeah. So it's about accountability, right? It's about being able to say, hey, we're going to be setting a good example. We're going to be accountable and all the way down through the last person on the team. We want to make sure that we're being secure. We want to create that culture where, we're not maybe necessarily punishing anybody every time they click on a phishing test or something like that, but making sure they recognize that at every level we're being held accountable, and we want to make sure that we're being as secure as we want to be, right? Or can be.
Absolutely.
So if they're doing the external testing, and again, I'm sure a lot of people on the webinar today don't need to be told this, but why is it not just enough to look externally? I mean, that's where the attacks are coming from primarily, right?
That's very true. And one of the things that people seem to misunderstand about internal testing, they think, well, if our external testing proves no one can get in, then in theory, we shouldn't have to worry about the internal side. And that's just not true. There's a lot of pieces to the internal world that are potentially misconfigured. As we grow with technology, the inside of a bank looks much different now than it did 20 years ago. We have multiple vendors that are operating inside of a bank using different technologies. And the truth, fact of the matter is those technologies that are not necessarily owned by the bank could be vulnerable, and they could be a way in that's not really owned or housed by the bank. And so one of the biggest things that we preach is you can trust your security tools all day long, but without validation of those things, it's hard to really know where you stand. And so we definitely recommend internal testing for that.
All right. So let's move to match number 2 then. And we're going to get outside the financial services industry for this one. Middleton Regional Medical Center in Middleton, Wisconsin. Again, completely fake. 300-bed hospital with affiliated regional clinics. They suffered a ransomware attack 3 years ago when a phishing email fooled their billing department, and they responded by, quote, printing everything to, quote, just be safe. They've taken steps to improve their security posture, including performing annual vulnerability scans and social engineering emails, but are still considering themselves more reactive than proactive. Their most recent phishing simulated test led to 36 staff members trying to register for what they thought was a summer camp. So obviously, I think, Justin, you've been doing this. Obviously, you do this. I don't do this testing sort of thing, but this isn't limited to just financial institutions, right? I mean, everybody is a target, and certainly, using a medical center as an example here in this match, they're just as much a risk as anybody else. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Yeah. The one thing that we preach a lot is when it comes to network security or cybersecurity in general, if you have a network and you're protecting data of any kind, you're a target. It doesn't matter if you're a financial institution or a hospital or an insurance company or whatever. There's always a risk.
So for Middleton Regional Medical Center to improve how it protects its data, what should it consider? If it's doing internal kind of vulnerability scans annually, it's doing a once a year social engineering phishing email, kind of what would we recommend for a scenario like this one?
Yeah, so something like this is where I would start looking at some more advanced offerings and start really digging into those kind of little pieces of their security posture. So if they're doing a good, solid external pen test and they're doing some internal review of some kind and they're doing social engineering to what they feel is an adequate amount, I would start focusing around things that are specific security controls, stuff like your firewall. Might be time to do a firewall review, or look at your email configurations and make sure that you have things configured correctly there and your filters are in place. Just the more advanced internal offerings and specifically to technical controls and things that you're, hoping are keeping you safe.
Sure. So just kind of, and again, I don't expect you to have anything other than your own opinion on this one, but sure. Why do you think non-financial institutions tend to lag behind when it comes to this sort of testing? Are they think they're bulletproof, or kind of what do you think accounts for maybe an organization, again, hospitals, maybe not, but maybe, the dry cleaner down the street, or somebody that certainly has data, certainly has customer information, things like that. What do you think drives that lag behind when it comes to testing?
I think a lot of it comes down to not being aware that they're a threat. It seems like across the industry, a lot of businesses that are not regulated. For example, hospitals are regulated by HIPAA, but when you're talking about a business like a dry cleaners, they may think they're not a target because why would anybody attack my business whenever there's all these big businesses out there? But the truth of the matter is the smaller businesses are actually becoming larger and larger targets because the bad guys know, just like we know, they're not regulated. They're not held to an industry standard. They're not being tested on a regular basis. And they're also housing people's credit card information and, whatever their business is. It could be all the way down to birthdays, social security numbers, whatever. So they are becoming a bigger and bigger target, and they're lagging further and further behind because they're not aware that they are a target. It's kind of what my experience has been.
So it's kind of, if nobody's there holding us accountable, again, using that word and saying, hey, you need to be doing this testing, that in addition to just plain kind of, oh, we're not going to, why would anybody come after us? We're not a, multi-million-dollar company or anything like that. But in reality, everybody's a target at this point in time, because all it is, you buy a list of, email addresses, or there's all kinds of phishing as a service, different things out there, right, that people can use, and you just plug in a handful of emails and you get one person to click on something and you're a winner, right?
Absolutely.
So in this example, we talked a little bit about, in this match, or there was a joke at the end there about 36 people clicking on a phishing email, a simulated phishing test, thinking they signed up for a summer camp, I think is what I put in there. What do you talked a minute ago with our first match about the importance of kind of more regular, more routine testing. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a third party come in once a month to do testing. There's obviously tools out there. I mentioned KnowBe4 earlier. There's others. But why do you think that's so important to kind of implement regular testing, regular training when it comes to information security and cybersecurity?
Yeah, so one of the big things around continuous testing is familiarity with the things they should be looking for. And you get the argument on the other side of the fence that says, well, if we test all the time, then they get numb to it. And that may be true to a certain extent, but it also builds constant awareness. And to me, that's the biggest protection level against something like phishing, is the constant awareness. And if they're constantly looking at emails for things like little misspellings or urgent notices or things that are, not quite normal, it builds a resistance to clicking. It slows people down. They don't immediately just click a link that's in the email. They actually read the email and make sure it makes sense. So it's more about the constant awareness than it is, the going through a specific training all the time. It's just constantly being aware.
Right. And I only add to that the way I feel about it, and when I do talk about KnowBe4 to people, I'm on the sales side, right? So I'm selling it and talking about the benefits, but it seems to me what we find sometimes is you do an annual email, like in this case, this match did, Middlefield Regional Medical here. They do an annual email, and probably for a week after that, for 2 weeks after that, people are super careful, right? They're reading their emails carefully. They're doing all the things you just mentioned. They're making sure they're not seeing mistakes or things like that. But you get 3 weeks out, you get a month out. It's just human nature, right? Things leave our brains. We're focused on other things. And now, that training that we took in November, now it's August the next year. I'm probably not being as careful as I would be if I'm getting tested more regularly. I assume you agree with that?
Absolutely. That's kind of what I was saying about that constant awareness. It's easy to forget about something that's not always in front of you.
Absolutely. So in terms of, like the testing itself, or, this in this instance, they're using just the phishing as a social engineering test. We obviously offer multiple kinds of social engineering, some that we're going to talk about when we get into more of the elaborate testing that we do. But, what other types of testing are out there that you've seen be beneficial for organizations, institutions, regardless of who they are?
Yeah, there's a lot of different social engineering offerings out there. Some that we offer, some other people offer, whatever. But the pretext calls where we call in pretending to be a client of the business and we're attempting to gain information about that client. Those are great examples of testing. vendor calls where we'll call in and pretend that we're a vendor and we're trying to gain network information or get them to click on a link or visit a website that we've created to grant us internal access, things like that. Physical impersonations where, I know a lot of times we'll go into organizations and pretend to be someone we aren't, trying to gain access to an area we shouldn't have. There's a lot of different options. Smishing is out there as an option. The text messages. There's a lot of different things that can be done. It's really just, it's all the same goal, and that's create constant awareness about the people that you're working with.
Do you see a lot of, and this is something I haven't prepped you for, but do you see a lot of the QR code squishing, right? Have you seen much of that?
So it's funny because that seems to kind of roller coaster up and down. There'll be an attack that comes out, and that's used QR codes, and it's a huge thing in the news for 5 minutes, and then it kind of goes back away, and people keep doing it. But it amazes me whenever you walk through, like I walk through my daughter's school, and there will be 25 QR codes plastered all over everywhere for, donations to things, or paid your, Cash App for this, for that, whatever. It blows my mind because I just think every time I walk through there, I could slap QR codes up all over everywhere and people would go to it without any question because of where it's at. So that's a huge one that gets overlooked a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when they were first, obviously when COVID, with all when restaurants were starting to roll out and getting rid of the menus and the QR code at the table, and just felt like anybody could have just stuck a sticker on there and just said, hey, go to this menu, right? So something to consider, certainly, but it is interesting that it's, maybe knock on wood, it's a good thing that it's not being as exploited as much as it probably could be.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was match number 2. Let's move on to match number 3. Granite Hill Federal Credit Union in Billings, Montana. $980 million in assets. They realized their previous information security program, a post-it note on the break room refrigerator that read, quote, "Don't click on weird stuff," was not adequate after a bad examination. They put more of an emphasis on creating a better security awareness culture, but more because they want to check a box than anything else. They currently have an annual external penetration testing and social engineering, as well as an internal vulnerability assessment. So Granite Hill Bank, or this should be credit union, I apologize, typo there, wants to continue to improve their posture. What would the next step for somebody who is already doing some of the things that you've mentioned? What would be a logical next step for somebody who's doing some of those things already?
So this is where I would start looking at something more along the lines of like our comprehensive network security audit that includes, it takes all the pieces of the things we've already talked about and it kind of puts them together in a comprehensive test. So the external testing, the social engineering, the email reviews, firewall reviews, internal stuff, kind of puts it all together. And the main point of that is our whole goal is from start to finish, we're trying to build a posture that works you towards an actual real world attack at the end of the day. And the closer we can get to that in realistic form, the more secure they're going to be and the more prepared they're going to be. And so for like the comprehensive, for example, with a small service where we'll do an external pen test and social engineering and maybe an IVA, those are all independent services. With the comprehensive, we're going to come back and we're going to utilize the social engineering as part of the external pen test. If we gain access to credentials or certain things, we're going to utilize that to give them a realistic approach to how someone would attack them. Similar to the inside, if we gain access to someone's password hash and we can go crack that and then utilize that to escalate privileges internally, we're going to do that. So it just starts to build on that kind of foundational of the external internal testing and starts to put all the pieces together is really the goal there.
Sure. So outside of just having more services performed, because, and actually I'm going to ask you to lay out kind of what the pieces are. So hopefully
we can do that
here. But kind of, if I'm reading and understanding you correctly, the best value or the best part of doing something like this is that it is that layered approach. It's not just a one-off. Okay, we're doing 3 services that are good. We want to be doing an external pen test. We want to do internal testing. We want to do social engineering. But the idea of having it all combined, all working together, is what kind of gives us almost a real world scenario. Now we're going to talk about very real world type scenarios in just a few minutes, but this is kind of a good entry point. And there are other companies. I don't want to make it sound like we're the first person that ever came up with something like this. Our CompNetSec audit is one of our more popular offerings, but I assume that's kind of the goal here is being able to have all this work together, to have it be, as you mentioned, just more of a real world type scenario. So maybe lay out kind of what's included as part of our CNSA and talk about how they work together, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of start externally. So with our comprehensive, it's like 6 or 7 major points, and kind of what we do, we start off with the external testing and social engineering. So we'll send in a phishing email, we'll make some phone calls, and we're trying to utilize that information to gain access to credentials. So with the phishing, if we send in a link and someone clicks it and puts in their information for us, we'll utilize that externally. So as we're doing the external pen test, if we find services that are available, we'll go in and we'll actually try to authenticate those credentials to that service, whether it's a VPN or specific login page or something like that externally available, trying to get into their M365 email, whatever we can. So the parts kind of work together. And then in doing that, it kind of leads us into the next portion of the comprehensive, which is the email configuration review. So as we're doing these tests, we're also going and checking things like your SPF record, and do you have certain, DKIM and DMARC things enabled so that we can't spoof certain, email domains and things like that. So it kind of works its way into that stuff. And then once we've kind of exploited all the external stuff and used it all together, we'll move towards the inside. We'll start looking at your firewall. What rules do you have in place? Do you have certain filtering enabled? Things along that line. Who has access to the firewall, change management, things around it in general. From there, we'll move into more of a posture kind of review. We'll look at your domain policies, group policies, what's your password policy, lockout policies, things like that. Make sure those are meeting industry standard, or if they're better than industry standard. A lot of times we like to have a conversation around why does somebody decide to have a 16-character password if industry standard's 8. And we get a lot of good information out of that, and it kind of helps us share it across the industry. But with internal, we also do the internal vulnerability assessment, where we'll do a credentialed internal vulnerability assessment, so you can really get an in-depth look at all of the patches on your network and what's missing, what's out there, and then we utilize those patch management scans to do the vulnerability testing. So we'll go see what vulnerabilities are there that we can exploit. In addition to that, kind of getting more in depth with the pen testing, we'll start looking at stuff like poisoning attacks. So can we capture credentials from people on the network? Can we utilize those to escalate, or find someone that has an admin credential we can get to? And we just go into a really deep dive with the internal pen testing. And then we also review things like remote access. Who has remote access in the company? How do they utilize it? Is their MFA enabled? Is there not? Can we bypass that? So it's really a very large group of services that we've kind of bundled together that we utilize interchangeably to try to gain as much access as we can and find as much negative as we can to help them kind of turn those things into positive.
So this would be, just going back to what this credit union was doing as part of this scenario.
Sure.
They had some issues. They've started to kind of get better about it. They've moved on to, they are doing external penetration testing. They're doing internal vulnerability assessments. They're doing social engineering. So if I'm understanding you correctly, this would be something where we kind of take that next step in maturity and we start to say, okay, all these services that are independent of one another that we're doing, and we're handing you a scan, and still kind of a little reactive, right? It's kind of more that compliance-based approach. And this is moving more in the direction of, while still touching the compliance-based side of things, but being more proactive in terms of understanding how all this can work together. Almost kind of, we're going to talk about red team, purple team testing in a minute, but kind of almost a gateway to that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's very fair to say. And I think that's a very accurate way to describe kind of the transition from the previous services to this prior to getting into something as advanced as a red team.
So, and I'm sure there are, again, everybody on the call is probably familiar with this, but just on the off chance, can you kind of just dig in a little bit more on what the difference between like doing an internal vulnerability assessment, which in this case, this scenario was doing, and some of the other ones as well, versus that internal penetration test, kind of what the benefit of doing both is?
So with the internal vulnerability assessment, the main goal is to give the client the most in-depth look at, I guess I'll say this, the most independent in-depth look of what their patching structure looks like. What vulnerabilities are out there? Did they know they were there, or are these things that they weren't aware of that existed on their network? And so that's really the goal, is to give them the most in-depth view. With the penetration test, it kind of expands on that. It gives it more of a I guess, test scenario. So not only are we finding what vulnerabilities are there, we're trying to determine, are they exploitable on your network? Are they things that we can actually maliciously go in and do that will harm your network, or allow us to capture credentials, or gain access to areas or things that we shouldn't have, or even wind up with a domain administrator account, that we've created based on the escalation of some privilege. So the pen test is just a much more in-depth version of what we can do with the things that we find from the vulnerability assessment.
Great. That's a great explanation. I appreciate that. So I do want to, before we jump to the next one, I want to talk a little bit about some of the ancillary services that, again, we offer, but I'm sure there are other companies out there. We're not the first people to do this necessarily, but I know one I really think could be valuable. So I'd love to hear kind of you explain it and then maybe talk about what you think the benefits are.
Okay.
We do offer assumed breach testing. Can you give us a little idea of what that is and maybe how it can be used?
Yeah, so the assumed breach testing is similar to an internal pen test, but it's done a little bit differently. So with an assumed breach test, we will typically get on the client's network with a device that we've shipped them. Sometimes we use their device. It just depends on the kind of the scoping. But the intention of that is for us to bypass all of the things that I just talked about in a pen test. So we don't have to go find vulnerabilities, and we don't have to go try to capture credentials and crack those creds to use them. We start out with that information. And so the client would provide us with a cloned domain account. So for example, if they have a teller account or someone's account has general permissions for the network, they would provide us that on the front end, and then we utilize that to do our testing. So the intention is we've already bypassed the original pen test where we've gained access to a credential. We now have access to that, and we're trying to see what can that person do on the network. Can we escalate those privileges? Can we bypass certain escalation procedures that we shouldn't be able to bypass? Can we get into things that they have access to that allows us to do additional attacks? So it's just kind of the next step of an internal pen test. It just bypasses the front end and allows us to go straight to the testing of a person's credentials on the network.
So, and I don't have a scenario for this one, but or a match for this one, but let's just hypothetically, let's say, somebody's been doing a comprehensive network security audit or a penetration test bundle or whatever it's called by whatever company does it for you guys. And they're doing it, and every year it's coming back clean. It's we can't get in, you guys are doing great. Would the assumed breach be something that maybe they apply in a year where they've already had a lot of success or they've been good about, the protections they have in place? That assumed breach could then be used to say, okay, well, what would happen if you did get in? Is that kind of, would that be a valid understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about between the differences with the external, and you've done that for a while, and what's that next step? It's the same thing internally. That assumed breach is a great next step because, like you said, if someone's done pen testing for a while and they have the same results or similar results, and they're blocking everything and nothing's really happening, that assumed breach is kind of that next step of, okay, let's say this did happen. What can we stop from that point? So it gives them the next level approach. So yeah, it's a great offering.
So we also offer, a bunch of other services as well. And I thought I'd just give you a second here to talk about something. I know we offer wireless penetration testing. We offer, we're going to get into some of the other, again, M365 and some purple and red team stuff later on. But any other services that we do offer pretty commonly that we might not have talked about so far?
Yeah, so we have a lot of what you refer to as ancillary products that we do offer that we consider valuable to people on the inside. So stuff like you said, a wireless. So we'll come in and do a wireless audit. We do those a lot of times combined with a comprehensive network security audit, where we will come in and we will test different wireless networks, whether those are secured or unsecured or guest. A lot of companies utilize what they consider board wireless, which is it's a wireless account that's only utilized by the board for, let's say, iPads for board packets or something like that. So what we do a lot of times is we'll come in and we will test those and see if we can, for one, can we gain access to them? Can we dump credentials by faking a wireless attack or creating a fake network that they connect to then utilize to connect to the network? So that's kind of the pen testing side of it. But one of the big important sides of it is the segmentation or segregation testing, which is where can a guest network see the internal network of the bank or the business or whoever we're working with. That's typically a big no-no. You don't want somebody that's on a free guest network sitting outside getting on your internal network. So that's a big portion of that. We do a lot of those. In addition to those, we do stuff like virtualization. So if you have a Hyper-V or a VMware environment, we can come in and do a full review of those things. Password audits, we can come in and dump a list of your passwords and put those through our cracking machine and see what that looks like. It gives you a good idea on password reuse and if people's passwords are following, protocol and things like that. So we have several ancillary products that are similar to those that are very beneficial for people.
That's great. Yeah. All right, let's move on. Riverbank, Maple Glen, Wisconsin, 450 million in assets. They recently migrated to Microsoft 365 with the help of their managed service provider, a process that went surprisingly smoothly if you don't count the 2 days it took everyone to stop asking, where did my files go? They are now taking advantage of many of the great features of M365 to collaborate, including OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, which has largely been used properly since the great meme debacle of early March. They feel secure-ish, but there's a nagging suspicion that configured by default might not mean configured correctly. So if Riverbank really wants to ensure that their M365 environment is secure, they should do what? They should get a what?
Yeah, I definitely are going to be looking towards an M365, at bare minimum, a scan of compliance, but preferably something a little bit more advanced that involves some consulting behind it, or at least some consultation with the scan to talk about their compliance and kind of things they should change.
So the M365 environment, obviously, as it was laid out in the match there, it is built to be collaborative, right? So all these things, and we use them, right? We use SharePoint, we use OneDrive, we use Teams, they make our lives a lot easier. But there's obviously danger that comes along with that openness, that collaborative nature. Do you have any feel about kind of what that looks like and what people should be looking for in terms of those sort of threats?
Yeah, one of the biggest things around M365 that we have a lot of discussions on involves permissions. And, I know that's an internal thing to a certain extent, but a lot of times with M365, there are constant changes to compliance or to what the best security practices are. And they change, it seems like quarterly. There's always something new coming out, new benchmarks. And so it's difficult to keep up with those things if you don't have 400 plus specific things memorized every quarter. It's one of those things you have to kind of work through. There's always a permissions issue. One of the common things that we see with M365 is with certain subscriptions, there are things that are activated or not activated. There are a lot of times we find things that people didn't even know they had. So that's always an interesting scenario whenever we come across something and we ask them about it and they're like, yeah, we don't use that. And we're like, well, your 365 subscription has it, so you are using it. So that's always fun, to talk about. But it seems to be that the biggest job around 365 is it's a borderline full-time engagement for someone all the time. And a lot of organizations don't have a designated M365 person or expert. And so they rely on outsourced third parties to kind of do those things for them. And as we all know, as great as some MSPs are and different third-party hosts, you're not their only client. So they're doing what they feel like they have to do as best, but it doesn't always fit the need. So definitely a good thing to have reviewed on a regular basis.
Yeah, so this is something that is a very proactive thing, right? This is not something that's, as far as I understand it, required for compliance purposes. You don't need to do an M365 assessment. So this would be something that you're taking on yourself to say, we know there's a danger here. We know we're going to be implementing it, but we want to make sure we're doing it securely and we're doing it in the best possible way. So I guess I would ask if I'm accurate with that, but also maybe another question to tack onto it is, I trust my managed service provider. I trust that they know what they're doing. They're not going to do anything, to spite me, certainly.
Sure.
But even if they do have it done by a managed service provider that they're confident in, we do have findings when we run into those sorts of environments as well. Is that right?
Yeah. It's kind of like I said, there are certain circumstances where, and it's not always anything major, right? I mean, it could be compliance type stuff, but there's a lot of times where, like I said, these things tend to change quarterly. And if an MSP has got 60 clients that are all utilizing this and they're trying to change these things for 60 clients all the time, it becomes difficult to maintain all the time. So we do have, quite a few MSPs and just different hosts that we work with a lot when we're doing these, to just trying to help them stay on board too. And most of them appreciate the effort because, like I said, this is a full-time job for every single organization that utilizes this. So anything we can do to make that easier for them, they typically are on board with.
And I was right in saying this is not a compliance thing, right? This is more of we're taking the next step.
Yeah, this is more of a best security practice posture, just trying to stay I mean, it is compliance to a certain extent. You want to be compliant, obviously, with the benchmark standards, but it's not a regulatory compliance at the moment.
So when would you say would be a good time for somebody to do this? If I'm Riverbank and I just migrated, that does seem like maybe the optimal time to have one.
Yeah, definitely a client that is recently gone to 365 and they've got everything configured. That's a great time because it allows someone to come in that is an expert in the field to look at these things and actually help you make sure you've got them all configured correctly. But another really good time to do this, I mean, we recommend it on an annual basis or semi-annual basis, depending on kind of your environment. But another great time to do this is whenever you, like businesses that merge, for example. We have a lot of banks that buy each other all the time, right? And so if you have a large bank that's using M365 and then they buy a smaller bank that's not, and they're integrating all these new users into this, a lot of times those settings could get misconfigured or overlooked or whatever. So that's a great time anytime there's a merger or an acquisition. That's something that we talk about a lot. But I would say at least on an annual basis, if you're utilizing this and you have a lot of growth and you're changing things a lot, I would definitely recommend doing this on an annual basis.
So a lot of the companies we run into and compete with, frankly, offer similar services. They do scans. We use scanning tools as part of our M365 assessment. I'm going to give you a minute here to tout what our M365 offering does, which I think is a little bit unique in the industry. I haven't run across a lot of companies that are offering what we offer. So I'm going to I try not to make this too salesy, but I think this is a really important distinction. So I want to let you talk about it a little bit.
Yeah. So, like you said, there are a lot of companies out there, and we utilize scanning tools also. I mean, everybody does because they're efficient, but a lot of companies out there will run a scan against your environment, hand you a list of what checks compliance, what checks not compliant, but they really don't give you any understanding or any information around those things, or why maybe you have something that is considered non-compliant, and maybe that is fitting for your organization based on how you're configured. The way we do this is we utilize a scan, but then we also utilize a lot of manual verification. So we use the scan kind of as a high-level overview of where to start looking at certain areas of the organization. So we spend, I don't know hours wise, but it's a considerable amount of time during the organization's engagement to go through with them, control by control, if that's what it takes, to actually walk them through what these settings mean and why they're important and how they apply or don't apply to their specific situation. So like I said, there's a very consultative type piece to our M365 engagement that a lot of organizations don't offer as a service.
Yeah, and I really think what I like about ours is, I mean, you laid it out perfectly, but I think that is kind of like an auditing, consulting, and an education engagement, right? We are going to go in and we're going to assess and make sure we understand where you're compliant, where you're not, so we can let you know that. But there is a lot of consulting along that process. There's a lot of making sure you understand it. And then there's also all the education that we provide so that, theoretically you understand it better going forward as well. So, I think it's a really excellent offering for anybody that is in the M365 environment. And it seems like obviously more and more are moving that direction. So I'm going to, again, go off script a little bit here on one other question I've got for you, just because we talked about it internally earlier today. What about someone who says, like, we are entirely in the cloud? We obviously have an offering where we can, for those that are using Azure in particular, can you explain a little bit about what our cloud compliance scan looks like?
Yeah. So like you said, we do have some offerings around the cloud-based stuff. Typically in the financial industry, what we run into a lot of times is, these hybrid environments. They have some cloud instance, but they also have some on-prem servers or virtual servers. Whenever someone says, hey, we're fully integrated into the cloud, that's a fairly unique in the financial industry right now. That's a fairly unique thing. But we do offer, similar to the M365, we utilize some scanning tools to check for compliance. We also will do some manual verification to go through and kind of assist them and make sure they have certain things, correctly configured within their organization, and depending on how their Azure environment is established. So similar to the M365 with that type of engagement, we do have some offerings for fully cloud integrated clients as well.
Very, very cool. All right. Last one here, match number 5, Sweet River Credit Union in Sweet River, Florida. This is a big one, $2.5 billion in assets. They're highly attuned to cybersecurity with a culture of protection that begins with the board. They're planning to, quote, fail well with an incident response program that includes more than a dozen scenarios, complete with play-by-play, including how to access emergency snacks because, quote, no one can respond to a cyber incident on an empty stomach. They do annual external and internal penetration testing along with social engineering, which includes phone calls and emails. They also do quarterly vulnerability testing and use a phishing testing tool to test their employees monthly. For an institution like Sweet River Credit Union, they should consider what to take their testing to the next level. So I know we have a couple of options here. I'm going to let you pick the one that you think would be a good starting point, and then we'll discuss the other one as well, Justin.
Okay, so for these guys, and I'm looking at this, this is definitely purple team, red team level engagement. The interesting part about red and purple team is it kind of depends on what their initial approach is or what they're trying to accomplish. So let's start with purple team because I think that's a great place to start. And we have a lot of debate on the team and then just individually about, do you go red or do you go purple, and which one do you do first, and so forth and so on. And we have a lot of organizations that are interested in red teaming, and we I don't want to say we talk them out of red teaming, we don't, but we end up talking about purple teaming, and then they're like, oh, let's do that first. And so with the purple team, it gives you a completely different approach than the testing. So while it's similar to like internal and external testing combined, we are typically using an engineer to work with your MSP or your internal team, your blue team, to show them the things that we're doing. We work through attacks. We show them poisoning, attacks that we run, and they're allowed to go in and say, okay, we're seeing this. Here's some traffic. How do we tweak what we're doing in order to catch this quicker or to, whatever. And so we do that a lot of times. But the other side of the purple team that I think is really neat that we do is if you have multiple findings that you see repeat. A poisoning attack is a great example of this, right? If we come in and we do a pen test and we're able to poison the network and capture credentials due to an MDNS or LLMNR or NetBio, something along those lines, and we're able to take those credentials and then crack them offline, and then you think you fixed the problem, and the next year we come back and we do it again, that's frustrating for a lot of organizations, and I totally understand that. And Purple Team is really neat because that allows us to come in and say, we know you have this problem. We're going to run this poisoning attack 50 times if that's what it takes for you guys to figure out how to mitigate this, stop this, and then be able to see this happening on the network. And so it gives them a really, really detailed approach at truly mitigating the things that we're doing during testing. And then the fun part for me, what I like to do that on the Purple Team side prior to a red team is because then when we come back later and do a red team, it makes our job a lot harder, but it makes them a much more successful in catching what we're doing, which really is the ultimate goal. Whether we're successful or not on the red team, they want to be the ones that get to stop what we try to perform.
Sure. So let's say I start with a purple team, which I think is a great recommendation. I move to the red team. What is a typical, again, and I use the word typical in air quotes here because this is a very, as I understand it, very customized engagement. When we scope these out, it's a pretty good conversation about what we're doing, what we're not going to do. This is, we don't want to communicate too much, but it is a very customized engagement. But what does a typical, air quotes, red team test look like then?
Yep. So we have, like you said, air quotes, what we call a typical red team. Typically starts at around 4 weeks in length. It's 2 engineers, and we kind of do it in what we consider a phased approach. And the first phase is our OSINT phase. And so open source intelligence gathering, that's what that is. And that's what we typically do for the first whole week. And when we're doing that, we're looking for any information on the target organization that we can find. We're typically not provided anything other than, obviously the client's name and whatever the business is that we're attacking. But we're looking for things like, who are your vendors? What do they do for you? What IP addresses can we find and associate with you, or web domains, or specific things online? We're looking for who are your employees, who are your customers, what do your locations look like, entry points, exit points, opportunities for us to go in and do physical impersonations or whatever we need to do. So the first whole week is really information gathering on your organization as a target. We make everything a priority and we find everything we can find. Once we've spent the first week kind of laying out what our options are, the second week is kind of what we consider initial attack, or phase 2, which is where we'll start throwing stealth scans at your network. If we found IP addresses externally, we're looking for open ports, things that we can connect to, things we can attack, In addition to that is where we start utilizing the information that we've gathered for social engineering. So if we've determined that you utilize a certain vendor for a certain thing, we will call in and start impersonating that vendor, trying to get you to allow us to put something on your computer or click a download link for a website or something that we've created to see if we can't gain additional information. Very similar to that, we do the physical impersonation. So now that we've scoped out all your locations, if you've got 5 buildings and one of them is huge and it's got 300 people that works in it, that's the one we're going to target, obviously, because that's going to be the easiest one for us to sneak in and plug something in and get out. So that's kind of phase 1 is just the initial, or phase 2, the initial attack. Phase 3 is what we consider persistence, which is where we've gained a foothold and now we're inside, or we are at least got devices inside, and we're trying to leverage those devices to gain access to anything we can internally. Let's say someone gave us credentials and we were able to get a device plugged into a network. Now we're going to try to utilize those credentials inside to gain access to share files or certain things that we shouldn't be able to see. So we spend a whole week, working towards that, trying to do that. Obviously building additional backdoors in case we were to get locked out. The fun thing about the red team is everything is a target. So whatever, literally everything, it's so opportunistic. So if we get on a device and it's got a share file and it's got 60 loan documents in it with all these people's social security numbers and all this customer PII, that's a target. I mean, that's exactly what we're looking for as an attacker, right? So we're treating this real world. We're grabbing that information and storing it, So it's not just about us trying to gain domain admin access on a network. It's also about what information can we gather along the way. And then week 4, if it's a typical 4-week, that's where we start wrapping things up. We start meeting with our initial contact for the engagement, talking through the things that we've kind of done, building reporting, and putting together kind of an outline of all the things that we attempted, all the logs, all the attacks, all the, everything that we have. And then we're giving them a full report on not only our successes, but their successes. Where did you stop us from gaining access? What are the things that worked? Those are the big things for clients, is for them to understand, yeah, we may have gained access in this area, but you stopped us in these 5. And so those are very valuable things for them to have, from a posture standpoint for an organization. So very fun engagement. We really enjoy doing them.
So I think I find it endlessly fascinating. I don't even get to do any of the fun stuff, but it is fun to listen to. But I remember we were having a conversation with a bank, even I think last week, about it and scoping it out. And you mentioned that as part of that OSENT phase where we're kind of figuring, looking into them and doing the research part, you even mentioned like looking at community events that are coming up and things like that. I mean, that just seems like being able to use that stuff to try to pull, use against people is a pretty fascinating part of this as well.
Yeah, it's super fun. And there's a lot, like I said, it's opportunistic, right? There's a lot of situations and things that happen and banks are great, but they're the worst about putting stuff on their website or Facebook about, hey, we're going to have a cute community event barbecue, or we're going to be doing this. All of those things are targets for attackers. As unfortunate as that is, that's like icing on the cake for us to be able to utilize for testing.
So how much communication, I assume the purple team, obviously we have more communication with the customer, but for a red team test, how many people are in the loop typically? What does the communication look like? And then, I think I know the answer to this already, but how far are we going?
Yeah. So purple teaming, we'll hit that one real quick. There's a ton of communication. It's almost constant communication. We're working directly with you and your MSP or your in-house team to make sure you know everything that's going on the whole time. So it's almost constantly communication. And the red team is the exact opposite. We prefer to keep as many people in the dark as possible because our intent is to truly provide a real world scenario. If an attack organization decides you're a target, that is how we're treating this. So we try to make as little noise as possible, as long as possible, and we try to keep as few people into the loop as we can. Obviously, when you're working with an organization like this, someone has to know. You can't just attack somebody, but we do try to keep that group pretty small. And in terms of scoping these things, we kind of let the client make that determination. Right. If they feel like they need to have a certain group of people involved, we're okay with that. We let them make that call, but ultimately we try to make it as small as we can.
And from a guardrails perspective, they're setting those guardrails, but we are going to push up against them as much as we probably can, right?
Yeah, so we typically come in with the approach of currently there's nothing off of the table in terms of what we can do. What do you want to put on the table? So obviously our intention is to never take down an organization. Obviously, if it's a business, it's there to make money. Like, we're not trying to get in the way of that.
Right.
So we do have certain guardrails that we will have people put up. Obviously, we're not going to come in with ski masks. That's not on the table. We get asked that kind of stuff. That's not something that we do. But there are certain levels of attack that we know can be disruptive. So we like to try to talk through those on the front end to make sure they understand, are you okay with us performing this kind of stuff? And if not, we need to know that now. So it just depends on what the client's looking for. But it's a very much so, like you said, customizable, very in scope kind of project.
So for a match like this, we're talking about somebody who's been doing some pretty comprehensive testing, has a really good information security program, has probably been successful for quite a while. And this is just, hey, we can keep doing this and keep getting clean, tests and scans and all this stuff year after year after year. This would be like hey, what would it be like if this really, really happened, right?
Exactly.
And then maybe even if we don't get in, you add that assumed breach. And then we're saying, hey, okay, well, you stopped us, great, but this is what it would look like if we did get in. So you could even go that far if you wanted to.
Absolutely. Yeah, you definitely could. And that's one thing I didn't mention, so I'm glad you brought that up. But yeah, we do kind of in that fourth week of engagement, if we're not having success, if we're pounding at the door in every way possible and we can't get in, we do offer that assumed breach portion of the testing because, like you said, congratulations, you stopped us for a month from gaining access. But what if someone did gain access, or what if they had 6 months to attack you instead of a month, or whatever? So that's a great offering as well, to be able to kind of additionally add to that package of, okay, we stopped them, we completed our mission, but if they did get in, now what can they do?
Awesome. All right. So we got through that. I think it was successful, but we'll see how the scores bear out in the survey here. Before we get to takeaways, and then hopefully I'll see if we have any questions. But Justin, I thought I'd give you a minute here. I know you guys are always working on fun stuff. You don't want to get too far in the weeds on anything we're doing, but maybe when I call you up and say, hey, let's do a cyber showcase in the fall or the early winter, what do you think some of the things we might be talking about at that point would be?
Yeah, we've always got something up our sleeve. We're always working on something. Social engineering is one of our favorite things in the world, so we're always kind of working towards what's our next offering for that. I don't want to give away a ton here, but we're definitely looking into the AI level deep fake type social engineering, cloning type stuff. That's always on the forefront. We're working on some working models for that. Generally the cloud stuff tends to be growing. I'm hoping to have some more advanced offerings towards the end of the year with that as well. So those are kind of the new things that we're looking at. But the purple team and red teaming seems to be growing just crazily, and we're really having fun with that. So we're definitely going to continue doing that as well.
Well, I'm sure we'll all look forward to talking again here toward the end of the year. But with that said, we're coming up on the hour mark. So I do want to just say takeaways quickly. A little typo there at the top again. But no matter your size or complexity, there's always room for improvement when it comes to network security testing. I think that's the biggest takeaway I think I would give you guys is, regardless of where you are, there's always a next level we can move to. It's just really about how proactive you want to be. But being secure doesn't always mean going from 0 to 60, right? And as Justin kind of mentioned a couple of times as we're going through this, you want to think about this as a progression. If we've never done external testing, we're probably not going to jump into red team testing. We would probably sell you that if we would at least have the conversation. But I think even we would probably try to get you to kind of ease into it a little bit. And then, as Justin kind of hit on, toward the end there as well, it's constantly evolving. We're constantly looking to provide more realistic simulation options so that at the end of the day, you get as real world a simulation as you can possibly get. So I think those are kind of the three biggest takeaways I would encourage people to leave here with. Justin, you have anything to add to that before I put our contact info up here?
No, I think we've hit everything. Like you said, we're not going to just sell people a red team, but if that's what they're looking for, we can definitely have that conversation. I just want to make sure they're meeting their best security needs.
Absolutely. So I'm going to minimize this and just see if we had any questions. I don't think I saw any. Nope. So we must have done a pretty decent job. If anybody does have any questions, I'll put our contact information back up here. Feel free to reach out to you, Justin, or myself. We'd be happy to answer any questions you've got. If you want to talk about your current testing, if you want to talk about future testing, or maybe moving to the next level, certainly we're happy to have those conversations. Again, please take that survey if you get a chance. And again, certainly if there's anything we can do, whether it's taking a look at the new NIST module, the new CRI module, talking about network security testing, we're happy to do any of that. So again, please feel free to reach out. With that said, really appreciate everybody's time today. I'm going to leave this up on the screen here. Justin, can't thank you enough for being here as always. Our first 3-time guest. And again, I'll probably bug you again toward the end of the year here. We'll get you on, but appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. Appreciate being here.
Thanks, everybody.